Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My fellow Americans, the sudden criminal attacks perpetrated by the Japanese in the Pacific provide the climax of a decade of international immorality. Powerful and resourceful gangsters have banded together to make war upon the whole human race. Their challenge has now been flung at the United States of America.
Welcome to the Not Old Better Show. I'm your host, Paul Vogelsang. Today, December 7th, 2016, is an important day to all. An important day to the greatest generation. And we're going to do something a bit different with two 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor episodes. Our memorial to memory segments are inspiring and engaging. In our previous episode, we spoke with journalist Natalia Navarro. For this second segment of the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, we're fortunate to be joined by journalist, Peabody Award winner, and executive producer of the new Smithsonian Channel series The Lost Tapes Pearl Harbor, Tom Jennings. Jennings' new program in the Lost Tapes series, Pearl Harbor, is a documentary like no other. You have to hear this interview and then see the program. By concentrating on what people said and thought in 1941, Jennings' program shows and gives us some very in-the-moment perspective on the day of infamy. Please join me in welcoming to the Not Old Better Show, Tom Jennings. Tom Jennings, journalist and executive producer of the Lost Tapes series. Welcome to the program. I have to tell you right out of the gate, I just found this program about Pearl Harbor riveting, and here we are on December 7th, an important day. Certainly this kind of day of infamy is well known, and from a production perspective of the series of the program, The Lost Tapes from Pearl Harbor, I just thought it was brilliant. You really give this sense that we're right in the moment, and very, very entertaining, but very different from how other kind of average documentaries might appear. How did you kind of come at this in just this way, kind of from just kind of a research perspective? I mean, some of this stuff has never even seen the light of day that you're showing us.
Well, thank you, Paul, very much. I'm grateful to be here, especially today.
Yeah.
And you're right. I believe that our documentary played different than just about any other documentary film made on Pearl Harbor. And I know that's a pretty bold statement, but we've gone back and looked at dozens and dozens and dozens of documentaries to make sure that I can say that statement. And at least in the last 20 years or so, there's been nothing like it. And what we wanted to do is there have been documentary films. I've participated in several that tell the stories about what happened on Pearl Harbor, and they use kind of what's the usual tool of documentary filmmakers, which is interviews with experts, survivors, descendants, using bits and pieces of stock footage, shooting what we call B-roll, or going over and getting scenics of the harbor itself, perhaps getting on warships today to talk about then and now. So a lot of that type of material has been done, and it's hard to put a viewer in 1941 when someone is telling you what it was like versus just letting a viewer experience it. And that was our goal. We've done this format in several other films where there's no narrator, there are no interviews, and we only use the media from the time to tell the story. And it becomes a very, very effective tool because instead of being told what you're seeing, you're experiencing what you're seeing and hearing. And I always kind of joke that the audience will sometimes be waiting for the narrator to come in and save them, and the narrator never shows up. It becomes experiential instead of just a normal documentary.
The other thing that I wondered about as just kind of a fan of yours and your programming and some of the work that you've done is this seems to be not only highly entertaining and different from a documentary standpoint, but also designed to be very much educational and give those generations that maybe didn't experience this time in our history a chance to learn a little bit about it in an interesting way, not of a typical kind of variety. That had to have been a goal too, I would imagine.
Yes, it always is. We try and, again, another bold statement, when we do films like this, for example, we did another one a few years ago for the Smithsonian Channel as well on the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, and that did very well for us. It won a Peabody Award, which is a very large award, big award in the world of television. And we like to think when we make these, because we gather every shred of media we can find, whether it's television footage, newsreels, radio, police dispatch tapes, handwritten notes, as you saw in the Pearl Harbor program, documents, photographs, everything. And we assemble it in a way that it feels seamless. So even though you're looking at source material from the actual event, we try and present it in a way that's, first of all, entertaining, because it has to be for television. But secondly, that people really feel like once they've watched this film, they'll feel like they've watched the definitive film about what it was like to be alive in 1941 and be a part of the events that happened on December 7th. And it's funny that you mentioned, we've had one broadcast of the Pearl Harbor film already, and it's showing several more times this week, including this evening. Several schools and teachers have contacted us already saying that they've never seen a film quite like this, as you've mentioned, and they would very much like to get copies and show it to their students in their classes, because they feel like this is one film that would make them understand at least a little bit more than usual what it was like to experience these events. So yes, that's a goal of ours, to make the definitive film of the event, and as far as the media available at the time is concerned, and I think in this case we did it.
Yeah, I agree you did. We'll put links up, of course, to the Smithsonian Channel schedule. It is playing several more times that I found, and I want to make sure and make my audience very aware of that. I guess one of the things that I wasn't so aware of, and it was, of course, a little bit before my own time, but nonetheless, this kind of this notion of there being this anti-war sentiment, and prior to the attack, maybe we were disillusioned from World War I. Maybe there were many things that were contributing to that, but I guess I was really surprised by that. I thought that there was almost a rabid sense of Americanism, maybe, and you really point out that wasn't the case. So it certainly wasn't a bold sentiment, but there was an anti-war sentiment going on.
It's funny you mentioned that, because everything old is new again, in a sense, and considering where we're at with our current political climate. At that time, and it's true, a lot of people forget about it, because after December 7th, we jumped in to the war, both theaters of the war, with both feet. But prior to that, there was, frankly, an isolationist movement that was very prominent in the United States. And in our film, we show a speech from Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, who was among those people that said, we're not going to get involved in the foreign wars of even our friends, for example, the United Kingdom. And it put Franklin Roosevelt in a terrible bind, because he and Winston Churchill were close colleagues, and he hated to see what was going on in England at the time, but his hands were tied. And so he did the next best thing, which was to supply arms and vehicles, and he made a very famous speech that's included or used the phrase that he had picked up in 1940 and used it at the end of 1940, where he said the United States, if we're not going to go to war, then we will be the arsenal of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, that's what we were until December 7th. Once that happened, everything changed. You see in our film how once word gets out, and basically that's what we try and do, is show how the news traveled across the United States and across the world about what had happened at Pearl Harbor, and how the sentiment in America shifted from, gee, we're not sure we should go to war, other people thought we should go to war. Everybody got on the same page, and it just became a rallying cry for all Americans. The isolationist movement went away. Everyone realized that this was a terrible wrong that needed to be righted, and it changed the course of our history as a country. And, the isolationist movement at that time is, you could say, in some ways similar to what's happening today. So I found it very interesting, the parallels that you can find in studying historical events that can mirror or echo what we're experiencing now.
Yeah, I thought those parallels were very evident and very powerful. This phrase, the arsenal of democracy, has parallels on a regional basis here in the Washington, D.C. area where I live in. And it's fascinating. I don't think a lot of the younger generation really understands this phrase. And every year, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum at Udvar-Hazy, which is out west by Dulles Airport, they fly a formation of these World War II aircraft over the Potomac east on their way to D.C., fly directly over D.C., circle the ball, and then return. And it's known here as the Arsenal of Democracy flight, yet no one really understands what that term is. And so it's so important that you're pointing this out, again, this idea of education, and I'm thrilled to hear that some of these schools are going to be using this as a way to learn more about this subject.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things, too, regarding education and presentation in documentary format is Pearl Harbor, gets boiled down to, and I think it's the fault of many documentary producers. It's just too easy to use the first 10 seconds, for example, of Franklin Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows that, what we would call today the sound bite. It's very famous. Even children today in school, they'll know that Day of Infamy moment. However, what most people don't realize is that the speech, we normally think of presidential speeches going on for 30 or 40 minutes. The Roosevelt speech on December 8th was actually less than 5 minutes long. And in those 5 minutes, he laid out the entire reasoning of why the isolationist movement had to change, why we had to go to war, that Japan obviously had been planning this for a long time. He mentions in the speech that the distance alone between Japan and the Hawaiian Islands shows that, regarding travel time of large aircraft carriers to cross that ocean would have taken, months of planning and days, if not weeks of travel. So it was an attack that was pre-planned, so therefore the United States had to strike back. And I mention that because once you get past the day that will live in infamy, most people can't tell you what Roosevelt said next. And in our film, you see the entire speech, all 4 minutes and 50 seconds or whatever it was. And you're not just watching Roosevelt the whole time. We're using film footage and photographs and such to illustrate either how people were listening to it at the time, or to also illustrate what he was saying and how the country is going to move forward. So one of the things that we have actually the luxury of, without having to always cut back to a narrator or someone explaining why the speech was important, we just play the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And those speeches are fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, I want to know what's on either side of the soundbite.
Mm-hmm.
What happened before and what happened just after.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, that's where the newness of the story comes out. And I think we've compartmentalized moments in history down to things like sound bites. And when you get to see how that bite played with everything else that was said, it takes on a completely different feel and almost a completely different meaning. Everything else that he said was equally as important, but just those few words are the ones that we can remember and nothing else.
We are with Tom Jennings, journalist and executive producer of The Lost Tapes. The Pearl Harbor episode is airing now on the Smithsonian Channel. We'll put up links to it. Tom, what I thought was also so interesting about this FDR speech, and maybe you can talk about this, but this was another thing that I really, it jumped out as being something really important, and that was this team of Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR, and how really the 5-minute version was very powerfully almost foreshadowed the night before during Eleanor's kind of. So talk a little bit about that too.
Well, this is another joy for us here at my company, putting these films together. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
and I had uncles, and my father were in the Second World War, and they, so I would hear these stories and not really get a sense of still what it was like, because they would be, war stories, as people would say. What we do is to try and put people in the moment of the events, and in exploring how those moments played out, we always find things that are completely surprising to me and to everyone else who works on these films. And I think perhaps the biggest surprise was the Eleanor Roosevelt radio address that you're referring to.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking to you tonight at a very serious moment in our history. The Cabinet is convening and the leaders in Congress are meeting with the President. The State Department and Army and Navy officials have been with the President all afternoon. In fact, the Japanese ambassador was talking to the President at the very time that Japan's airships were bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines and sinking one of our transports loaded with lumber on its way to Hawaii. By tomorrow morning, the members of Congress will have a full report and be ready for action. In the meantime, we, the people, are already prepared for action.
Most people think the Day of Infamy speech is the first time that the country, the nation, the leaders spoke to the United States about what had happened. It turns out that's not the case. It was actually the president's wife, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, gave an address the night before, the same day of the attack, December 7th, 1941. And she gave that address not because she was trying to upstage her husband, but because, and this part I didn't know, that during her time as First Lady, she, for several years, had her own weekly radio address where she would tell stories about interesting things that were happening in the country, especially as the wars were starting up overseas. She would talk to servicemen and their families and, talk about their concerns and worries. And her radio program just happened to broadcast Sunday nights. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was on a Sunday. The other thing you should know about her broadcast is that because she was the First Lady and was busy, it wasn't always live. It was often pre-recorded. And that evening's show had been pre-recorded. However, because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, she went into a studio and she did, again, 5 minutes. It must have been a favorite of the Roosevelts at the time. She did about 5 minutes talking about what had happened that day. And that was a live broadcast. And she was trying to calm the fears of people in the country, especially she spoke directly to the women in the country, worried about perhaps their sons who are overseas, stationed in the military already. And it was so heartfelt when you listen to it. And again, we play almost the entire thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you're getting to hear Mrs. Roosevelt speaking the day of the attack as the person who really first draws the country together through what was very powerful at the time, through radio. And one, I didn't know that she was the first one to make a statement. And two, I didn't even know that she had a weekly radio broadcast. We usually think of Franklin Roosevelt with his fireside chats, but we don't think of Mrs. Roosevelt doing the same thing.
Yeah, that was particularly fascinating to me, as the rest of the program was. All of this material, these audio recordings, some of the radio reports that you're able to bring in, even the photographs, I thought were just remarkable to see of that time. Something else that I didn't know about, and we'll end with this because I do know you're very busy, Tom, but this man on the street interview that Alan Lomax was doing, and he did these on a variety of subjects around this time period. He really captured this in the moment sentiment that you refer to, and I thought that was just brilliant. And so coming across some of this stuff again, where did you get this, and what was your reaction as you started to hear some of this material from Alan Lomax?
I think the Alan Lomax stuff came from the National Archives. The National Archives is terrific, but they have so much stuff there. Sometimes they don't even know what they have. And their researchers work with us. They're really terrific. And we had found out in just doing general research that Alan Lomax had gone out and done these interviews along with, he had crews working for him as well across the country, going to major cities, doing man-on-the-street interviews. And Alan Lomax was a very famous American folklorist, if you want to call him that, and where he would go out and chronicle people's lives, kind of a Jack Kerouac of American folklore. And so one of the things that he did was he would take his radio equipment and an assistant or two, and would go around and talk with people about whatever was going on, news of the day. And of course, on December 8th, the following day, Monday, the news of the day was that Pearl Harbor had been attacked and the nation was most likely about to go to war. So he went out, and he was specifically in Washington, D.C., and he just started talking to people. And there are dozens and dozens of hours of not only Alan Lomax, but his colleagues in various cities across the United States talking with members of the public about what they think just happened. And that's where I didn't know those existed until we dug a little deeper and found them. Two, they were in incredible condition. When you listen to it, it sounds like they were recorded yesterday. Mm-hmm. And another point is that most people don't know that kind of material existed to help put you in the moment of what was going on back then. Mm-hmm. And you really get to hear, what fascinated me is that they would ask these questions. And, we live in a time where everything seems to be so fast and people just react in such a quick way. And you could hear when he would ask the question about what people thought, that they would take a moment and they would think about what they were going to say. There was this pause about, here's what I think, and here's, everyone felt like they were a part of the process. And I found that admirable. It's referred to as the greatest generation back then. And just listening to these ordinary people comment on something extraordinary like the attack on Pearl Harbor, you really get the sense that people did feel involved in the American political process, and they did feel like they had a stake in what had happened in Pearl Harbor. And it adds a genuineness and almost an intimacy for viewers that watch the show to get an understanding of how average people, like most of us are, had to interpret what had happened in Hawaii that day.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. It's really wonderful. Again, these particular interviews, they've not been featured in any other documentary, and so you're really getting a sense in that time of that mood and just the very real, kind of tone and expressions on faces. It's brilliant. Tom Jennings, journalist, executive producer of The Lost Tapes. I know there are future episodes of the series The Lost Tapes coming up. You're working on a bunch of stuff right now. Son of Sam, is that right? And a couple of others. What's coming up?
The Son of Sam murders in New York City. The kidnapping of Patty Hearst, and the next one coming out is going to be in late April, which is for the anniversary of the Los Angeles riots. So they're all big moments in time in our the news of our recent history, and we're going to do the same thing and try and make sure that people feel that once they watch our films about those events, they'll feel like they've seen the definitive program and know that there's the way we presented it and makes them feel like they wouldn't have to see another film about it because they've seen the best one.
Yeah, I just can't agree more. The Pearl Harbor is the best one. It is not to be missed. Tom Jennings, thanks so much for joining us. I know you have got a ton of things going on, and on December 7th, for you to spend a few minutes with us is just very great of you. So thank you so much.
Paul, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
And we'll follow up with you too. I want to learn more about some of these other series that you've got coming up. But thanks.
Sure.
Yep, good. Well, thanks, Tom. Have a good one.